Hello all, my name is Kelly White, and this week I had to analyze the Periplus Urethrae, also known as the voyage around the Erythraean Sea, or as we now know it as the Red Sea. This Periplus was written by an anonymous Greek merchant. The time period historians still debate about when it happened, but it is most commonly agreed that this was written around the mid-1st century in the Common Era. This work provides insight to what the European world knew and viewed about the lands surrounding the Indian Ocean. It describes in a lot of detail like a step-by-step account of this man's voyage, starting in Egypt and going as far south as modern-day Tanzania in Africa, and starting in Egypt again and going as far east as the west coast of India. He describes along the way a lot of different things that I'm about to dive into detail with. In terms of ancient primary sources, I found this one to be interesting and easy to comprehend, so that's good. Without further ado, here are some details about what this guy witnessed on his travels. He starts out by providing specific names of market towns, as what he calls them, or port cities. He explains what to find there, goods, and the quality of goods. Some port cities only had a few resources being sold. Other port cities had a lot. And those goods varied. We got metals being traded: bronze, gold, silver, copper, sesame and palm oils, frankincense and myrrh, rice, wheat, cloth. He spoke kind of poorly about Egyptian cloth and more highly about Indian cloth. Slaves, but in particularly he emphasized female slaves more often than just generalized slaves. So I found that kind of interesting. Not sure where he was getting at with that one. Anyway, also ivory and tortoise shells, those two were mentioned the most. Very highly valuable goods, of course, as we all know. There were pearls, wine, pepper, silk, diamonds, and sapphires, just to name a few. As mentioned before, some ports only had a limited amount of resources being traded. Other ports seemed like they had a lot more going on. And he notes where to anchor down your ship, which I also thought was helpful. Where to leave your ship. He warned that if you put it in certain places, you might get attacked from the people living on the land or in the islands. And he also mentioned the dangers of anchoring down in certain spots where the sea swell could be dangerous. Whirlpools that exist, drifting sandbars was a huge concern back in this Periplus, things like that. So he warned you, which I thought was very helpful to any traveler going along here, where to put your ship, right? Anyway, he goes on to explain two types of people. First, we got the Berbers, which in parentheses was translated to foreign or non-Greek, and he emphasized this a lot. And he would specifically mention Berbers, but he would also describe some of these people as barbaric, savages, criminals, unruly, but then he also made sure to mention that if they are peaceful, that most of them were established by law and were well versed in Greek literature and things like that. So I found that kind of interesting. To the people that he might have been less familiar with, he described as savage, and the people who were more familiar with Greek culture, Greek literature, he described them as more friendly. So I kind of find that funny in a sense. Anyway, he also explained how to get along with these Berbers, the native people, in not every situation, but he did mention some, on how you have to trade a lot of goods with the king or feast with them. So he was explaining, like, if these people are being unruly or criminal-like, that this is what you can do to avoid that from happening to you, to avoid, them hurting you. So I found that interesting, but again, he listed specific cities where, specific ports where, the people might not be as friendly. So again, I found that helpful. It's not just, you sail 2,000 miles, you run into not nice people. So I found it very helpful that he describes this. He also, in depth, did distances between each port town. There's a lot of math involved, so I did not actually translate from Greek measurements to our measurements in terms of miles, but I found it very helpful that he would explain, if you sail 1,500 miles this way, Greek miles this way, then you're bound to hit this. Or, okay, you're leaving this port town, sail east for 200 miles. And I found that to be helpful because, again, if anyone wanted to duplicate his travels, they would be able to. He also mentioned one kind of humorous point here, that in some villages, specifically in point number 27 in his Periplus, that the native people would use inflated animal skins as rafts to get from one side of the river to another. And I compared that to when we had to watch that documentary, Grass, a few weeks back, and how the nomadic people also used inflated goat hides to get across the river. And so I kind of found that funny, but in a sense I'm also making a connection here that even though those two tribes were very far away from each other, very different in terms of climate and weather and everything, that it just shows you that no matter where you're from, people will use what they have available to them in order to survive. So I found that kind of interesting, and just the concept of it is kind of funny to me. Anyway, he also explains the best times to travel to these places. Not always, but he did mention that July seemed to be a good month to travel. He warned of monsoon season and flood season and droughts and all of that good stuff, but overall it came back to July as the overall best time. In terms of goods, he explained, and I mentioned this earlier, where to find the good quality goods. Early on, he said Egyptian cloth was not as high quality. Sometimes it wasn't even dyed, it was fringed. But if you bought Indian cloth, that it was a higher quality, you basically get what you pay for. And so I found that helpful. And he also went on to explain how there are different types of tortoise shells, whether they were like sea tortoises, land tortoises, mountain tortoises, I believe was mentioned, and how their shells are different. And so he was basically, it was like a buyer's guide in the sense of, if this is what you're looking for, look for this texture. If this is what you're looking for, go to this port city. If this is what, so on and so forth. And so I found that helpful. So again, you could know where to go and what to buy, which again, we still find that helpful in today's day and age with things like Yelp, right? Where do we go for the best oil change, for the best burger in town, or whatever? We still go off of other people's accounts for what to go, for where to go, what to get, whether you're exploring the country, a different country, or your town. So again, it's very easy to connect back to present day to make sure you're getting the best thing that you're paying for, right? Sounds like it's human nature, according to the Periplus. Also, if you were running into any tribes, he would mention the names of tribes, but he also made it a point to mention if it was Persian territory or not, which I found interesting, right? Kind of like battle of dominance there. And so kind of like, be warned, this is Persian territory. So I found that interesting. He also mentioned the conditions at sea. So not only did he mention going into these towns and what to expect in terms of goods and running into people, but he also mentioned what to expect while you're at sea. And the biggest concern when you're traveling at sea for that long amount of time are the conditions of the water. He mentioned if you go into certain bays, if the land starts getting more, coming closer together, or if it opens up, like, be careful, there are violent waves here. So kind of like you made a wrong turn around type of a deal. Whirlpools, drifting sandbars, flooding, be careful not to wreck your ship on these sandbars. People think, oh, I can dock here. No, you can't. Your ship will get wrecked. And so again, I found it interesting and helpful that, again, it's a guidebook. It's a travel guidebook. Where to go, where not to go. And again, we still see that need in today's culture as well. He also mentioned encounters, if you can even call it that. He mentioned animals that he has seen on his travels. Crocodiles, elephants, rhinos, leopards, giant serpents, hyenas, baboons, but he doesn't really go into too much detail about any negative interaction with these animals. He even made it a point to say that the crocodiles do not try and bother man, which I thought was interesting. You know, we all kind of stereotype crocodiles to be man-eating. So that kind of goes to show me that animals, despite him traveling all this way, he did not have any concern with the exotic life that you will not find in Europe. That if you see these giant animals, it's okay. Which again is very helpful. I have to imagine, you know, your first time seeing a rhinoceros or a giant snake or a baboon, it can be very frightening. Like, is this thing going to try and eat me or what? And so again, I found that even though he didn't go into too much detail, I can assume in this case no news is good news. That like you have nothing to fear if you see these giant horned animals or these colorful beasts, like it's okay. And so anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. He also made a point to mention if you need a big ship, a small ship, what ports require small ships and whatnot. He was very detailed in all of this, which again I found very helpful. So that way you're not just bringing along a large ship and shooting yourself in the foot if you need a small ship and you don't have one. So I found that helpful. The last thing that I will say that he mentioned were the savages that he encountered on this trip, more specifically at the end of his trip. So the first part of this is when he is in Egypt, sailing down the coast of Africa, all the way down to modern-day Tanzania. And when he describes the people he sees there, he just makes mention that they're peaceful or unruly or uncivilized. But when he gets down, the second part of this is when he's going as far east as the western coast of India, and he's describing these tribes as being flat-nosed, long faces, cannibals. That made me kind of question why. Why do the people closer to Egypt get described as just unruly versus the people near India being described as cannibals? And so one loose connection I made with this, now whether or not those people are cannibals, I don't know, but one connection I did make with this was I remember reading Marco Polo in my undergraduate studies, and how a lot of scholars kind of said Marco Polo was a liar, that he didn't actually travel all that way, and they only say this because his accounts of the people that he came across in his travels were very inaccurate to what we know of. But, you know, obviously it's a very loose connection, but it's the same sort of thing. Maybe this Greek merchant was more familiar with the people around Egypt, because if you think geographically speaking, Egypt and Greece are closer together than Greece and India. So, you know, he kind of explains in this how the further east he went, the more uncharted territory he came across. And so it made me wonder that he's starting to describe these people later on in the Periplus as savages and flat-nosed cannibals, because he was just so unfamiliar with them that maybe the thought of it scared him a little bit. People look way different than he did, I'm sure. Just, again, based off of geography. So, you know, my question was, you know, is that an accurate account, or was he just saying that because he was genuinely unfamiliar with the tribes and people there? And then last one, kind of like Marco Polo to an extent, a lot of historians argue that this Periplus is a very accurate depiction. Like, this guy actually did all the travels. Again, like I mentioned, I remember hearing that there were some questions about Marco Polo and his tales being genuine, but many historians will agree that the Periplus is an accurate account of a man who actually traveled all that way because of his very detailed descriptions of everything. Names of ports, names of bodies of water, names of tribes, names of the kings of these tribes, Persian Empire territory, cannibals, animals being seen, goods exchanged at each specific port that he had mentioned. And again, there are over 60 points in this Periplus. So again, most historians and myself now agree that he actually did all these travels and he actually came across all these things. And what I found most interesting about this, besides it being a guidebook, a travel guidebook, a survival guide, and a buyer's guide, was the fact that up until recently in this class, we've been studying the inland routes along the Silk Roads and, the nomadic tribes on the steppes and all of that stuff. And so now with this Periplus, we're looking at the coastal stops along the Silk Roads. And it's a very different account being made. Obviously, we're not talking about horseback and, riding along for miles across Mongolia and China. We're finally talking about the coastal cities. And again, at least for me, I never thought of the Silk Roads as being on the coast. So it opened up a new perspective for me, at least. And overall, I found the Periplus very interesting, easy to comprehend, and very relatable to common day because, as mentioned before, to this day, people are still looking for detailed accounts of what it's like going to a different country, what the people are like there, what to buy at certain marketplaces, where to eat. And overall, I just found it very interesting to read. Thanks for listening.